When we look at the vast array of stories that have accumulated over time, we may feel as though we have enough literature to give an accurate depiction of the human experience. Today, I would like to make an argument against this idea. Because of the way that cultures canonize certain works or give them privilege over others, many of mankind's stories are lost to time. Some may refer to this phenomenon as the master narrative. At the root of the argument is the idea that privileged perspectives are the ones that have been remembered. Libraries are full of accounts written by white men, and there are countless stories that have never been heard about the lives of oppressed groups such as indigenous peoples and slaves. One of the ways that the master narrative is perpetuated is in the way that authors have depicted minority groups in their works. When the literary canon has created an expectation that a group will act in a certain way, such as Native Americans being savages, it spreads falsities that continue to be told in story after story. Two examples that I would like to present come from Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown and Henry David Thoreau's Resistance to Civil Government. Both of these pieces are well read enough to have been included in the Norton Anthology of American Literature. In Young Goodman Brown, the main character is walking through a dark wood when he states, "There may be a devilish Indian behind every tree." He begins to act afraid, as if an Indian may jump out and attack him. This type of rhetoric was not uncommon, and it led to many white readers considering Native Americans to be dangerous in some way. When prejudices like this are supported through literature, they only become more widespread and seem more justified by those who hold them. In Henry David Thoreau's piece, Resistance to Civil Government, he also perpetuates this idea of a certain group being a part of the other, or somehow worth less than white Americans. Despite this piece being an anti-slavery work, Thoreau uses Chinamen, Malays, and Musselmen in a derogatory, negative way. He suggests that Americans should act better than these groups, stating that those who disagree with him are a distinct race from me by their prejudices and superstitions as the Chinamen and Malays are, and criticizes those who will not stand up for change by comparing them to the Musselmen. Similarly to how Hawthorne's depiction of Native Americans furthered negative stereotypes, Thoreau's political piece also perpetuates the idea of differences between races and that one race is better than another, namely the white race. Another piece that I would like to briefly mention is Benjamin Franklin's Remarks Concerning the Savages of North America. This piece presents a rare case in which someone challenges the master narrative. Franklin writes about his observations of native culture, arguing against the widely held belief that they are mere savages. Through anecdotes, Franklin shares some of the ways that native culture may actually prove better than the American culture of the time. For example, he talks about how when conducting a formal discussion, natives will make sure that they allow silence in between speakers in case they want to add anything to their statement, whereas Americans would usually talk over one another. Pieces like this help to shed light on how the master narrative can sometimes be misleading. While it is important to consider the impact of the master narrative on issues of racism and discrimination, there is a more profound problem with the existence of a literary canon. Like I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, when we leave it to the people in power to decide what works should be canonized, we end up with the loss of culturally diverse literature. In the Norton Anthology of American Literature, beginning to 1820, there are 8 stories that fall under the Native American oral literature section. While it is good that these stories are being taught today, it is impossible to wonder where the rest of them are. It is expected that oral literature will be less frequently anthologized due to the type of storytelling, but one must also consider the fact that we are having to go back and recover many of these stories because it is just recently that we have recognized the importance of preserving Native American history. Imagine if Native American trickster tales were being shared with white readers centuries ago. I imagine that the sharing of stories would have made a world of difference in the companionship between different cultures. Similarly, when we consider slave stories, we are often happy that these historical experiences have been able to be preserved for future generations. As readers, we also recognize that due to the circumstances of slavery, we will never know the whole story. Harriet Jacobs, famous for her slave narrative titled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, was one of the few slaves that were lucky enough to share their story with the world. In Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, we gain insight into the atrocities of life as a female slave, and follow Jacobs on her long, dangerous journey to freedom. After finishing this piece, I was left considering all of the women who did not make it out of their situations. I considered all of the men and women who were killed for speaking out against slavery. I considered all of the stories that will never be told. As readers, I believe that we have a responsibility to do what we can to fight back against the master narrative. This means showing support for stories that speak out against it. This means allowing people from different cultures to speak for themselves, to share their truths, rather than allowing those in power to dictate what we believe. Share these stories with your friends. Amplify diverse voices. The more we do so, the more likely it is that we will be able to create a new canon, one that shows all sides of humanity, not just the white side.
And in leading the tours, I understood the importance of the narrative, or at least it was further cemented in me, the importance of the narrative, and how badly a missing narrative can affect history.
Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower.
We need people to tell more stories that do not correspond to the master narratives. We need more people to push back against stories that only tell a partial truth. Whoever controls the narrative has power. So take control of your story.